By the election of 1800, the Federalist Party was in serious trouble. Internally, it was split between the conservative faction led by Alexander Hamilton and the moderates led by President John Adams. Hamilton and other high Federalists thought that President Adams had been too soft on the French and their American sympathizers. This reflected in part a political calculation that the looming threat of a full-scale war with France could be used to the advantage of the Federalists in the upcoming 1800 election. Adams, however, set aside partisanship and resolved the crisis through diplomacy. Despite this success in securing peace with France, Adams faced serious problems in his bid for re-election. Not only was his party internally fragmented, but there were a number of issues that the opposition party could use against him. The fact that the Federalist Congress had created a large standing army, officered mostly by Federalists, raised the fear in many Americans that they intended to use this as a tool of political coercion. The Democratic Republicans could also point to the highly unpopular Alien and Sedition Acts and to heavy taxes, such as the whiskey tax, as examples of Federalist excesses. The Federalists in turn blasted their opponents as potentially dangerous radicals who would bring the violent extremism of the French Revolution to American shores. In the end, though, the public sided with the Democratic Republicans, and it was Thomas Jefferson, not John Adams, who became president. Jefferson, who enjoyed the support of a Democratic-Republican majority in Congress, triumphantly declared the election as the, quote, Revolution of 1800, unquote. Jefferson certainly did seek to change the direction of the nationalist government in many ways. During his 2 terms, Congress allowed the Sedition Act to quietly expire, eliminated many of Hamilton's taxes, and dramatically reduced the military establishment. The Democratic Republicans also sought to check Federalist influence over the judiciary. Following their loss of power in 1800, the outgoing Federalist Congress had passed an act to expand the national court system. This gave President Adams the opportunity to pack the national courts with sympathetic jurists. On his last day in office, Adams continued to sign off on these appointments. The Democratic Republicans scornfully referred to these as Adams' midnight judges, and promptly repealed the Judiciary Act which had created these posts in the first place. Their next step was to launch impeachment proceedings against John Pickering, a Federalist appointee in New Hampshire. Pickering was obviously incompetent and unfit for the bench, which made it easy to remove him. But the case against Samuel Chase was much more controversial. Chase, an associate justice on the Supreme Court, was a highly partisan Federalist, using his position to launch diatribes against the Democratic Republicans. However, it was also clear that he had not committed any high crime or misdemeanor, the only grounds on which he could be removed. A number of Democratic Republicans, including Jefferson himself, balked at this naked attempt to politically manipulate the court, and Chase remained on the bench. Overall, Jefferson proved far less radical than his opponents had predicted. While undoubtedly partisan, he also sought to reach out to moderate Federalists, assuring them in his inaugural address that, quote, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists," unquote. He also tempered his ideological commitment to limited government with a strong dose of pragmatism. This was demonstrated in 1803 when Jefferson sent a delegation to France to purchase Louisiana Territory. While he doubted whether he had the power to do this without an explicit constitutional amendment, he recognized the enormous importance of this purchase for the United States. The Louisiana Territory had been given to Spain in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, but in 1802, Spain secretly ceded this region back to France. Unlike Spain, which was a fading power, France under Napoleon boasted one of the strongest militaries in the world, and Napoleon had ambitions to extend his empire in the New World. He was particularly interested in reclaiming the lucrative sugar plantations of Haiti, which had thrown off French colonial rule with a slave revolt in 1791. He saw Louisiana as a key base of operations for this attempt. The prospect of having the powerful French Empire as a neighbor, with the potential that it could shut down American access to the Mississippi and the vital port of New Orleans, raised deep concerns in the American government. Indeed, access to New Orleans was a key issue. The delegation Jefferson sent was originally charged not with purchasing the entire territory, but only the port. Upon arrival, however, they were rather shocked to learn that Napoleon was not only willing but eager to sell off the entire region. Why? In part, this reflected the renewal of the French war with England and Napoleon's need for immediate cash to pursue this war. It also reflected the fact that his efforts to retake Haiti had failed. Ultimately, Jefferson was able to purchase this entire region for just $15 million, effectively doubling the size of the United States. He declared this new territory would be an empire of liberty, since it would provide the open land necessary for ordinary Americans to move west and set themselves up as independent yeoman farmers, what Jefferson saw as the critical backbone of the Republic. Despite the many successes of Jefferson's administration, the war in Europe proved to be as troublesome for the Democratic Republicans as it had for the Federalists. With the renewal of the conflict between France and England in 1803, the U.S. struggled once again to keep itself neutral. In one sense, the war was a great opportunity. The overwhelming dominance of the British Navy made it virtually impossible for France or its allies to move cargoes on its own ships. Increasingly, they relied upon the merchant vessels of neutral countries, particularly the United States. At the same time, American exports to Britain soared. Profits for American shipping interests grew, but it also put the U.S. in a delicate situation. Both sides attempted to block American trade with their opponent, but the British, backed by a strong navy, proved to be much more effective. They became increasingly aggressive in stopping American ships and searching them for deserters from the British Navy, although in many cases the sailors they seized were actually American citizens. The government struggled to find some way to deal with these egregious violations of American neutrality. In 1807, Jefferson declared an embargo of all American trade to Europe, arguing that, quote, "Our commerce is so valuable to them, they will be glad to purchase it when the only price we ask is to do us justice," unquote. Unfortunately, he proved to be overly optimistic. Neither France nor Britain was persuaded to relent, and the loss of European trade devastated the American economy. Huge numbers of U.S. merchants routinely violated the order, just as they had defied British attempts to regulate trade during the colonial era. Clearly a failure, in 1809 the Embargo Act was modified by the Non-Intercourse Act, which allowed trade with all European countries except Britain and France. The following year it was modified even more with Bacon's Bill No. 2, which lifted all trade restrictions, but also stipulated that if one belligerent power agreed to respect the rights of American neutrality, the president could reimpose trade restrictions upon their rival. When Napoleon, in rather vague terms, promised to respect American rights, President James Madison, who had been elected in 1808, promptly cut off trade with Britain. The failure of these economic measures finally led the government to take a more belligerent stance. A group of young congressmen, known as the War Hawks, spearheaded this movement. Motivated primarily by the desire to avenge these insults against American sovereignty, they also had an eye upon expanding the territory of the United States by annexing Canada to the north and Florida to the south. With these objectives in mind, in 1812 they persuaded Congress to declare war upon Great Britain. The early stages of the war proved challenging. Lacking a strong army, the United States relied largely upon citizen soldier militias, typically with only minimal training. 3 attempts by the United States to invade Canada failed, and the British successfully rallied many of the native tribes on the frontier to aid in their cause. British advances were checked in 1813 with an American naval victory on the Great Lakes and the defeat of British and Native American forces at the Battle of the Thames. By 1814, however, the war in Europe had ended, freeing Britain to focus its entire military power upon the United States. They launched an attack against the eastern seaboard, which promptly captured Washington, D.C., which they burned to the ground. In the north, they launched an invasion from Canada, while in the south, they prepared to take the port of New Orleans. Yet, despite the huge military capabilities of the British, American forces were able to frustrate their efforts. While they succeeded in destroying the capital, their attempt to capture Baltimore failed, foiled by the resolute defense of Fort McHenry, an event which would later be celebrated in our national anthem. The thrust from Canada was likewise turned back with another American naval victory on the Great Lakes.